Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Parks Institute seminar. And it's a great pleasure to introduce to you David D. I've known David for some years now. I was talking to my sort of contemporary Brian Chayette about how Brian and myself, David says, Ron, used to be the young Turks of British Jewish history. And now on the edge of retirement, we're not so young anymore. But David certainly is of a different generation, and it's great to have someone following our work. There's a connection to David's topic tonight in terms of where I first met David. I'm not sure if you remember this or not, but I was his external examiner. And to someone from the outside the examination room, it looked like I'd been sort of beating David up in the Viva because he ran out in the middle of the Viva with a nosebleed. But I like to put it on official record here that I didn't hit him, and that's not the normal technique for doing a PhD Viva. Certainly not at Southampton, and I don't think at De Montfort University either. So, as I say, we've those of us who sort of developed a new approach to British Jewish history, and particularly a social history in the 1980s, it's really wonderful to see a sort of a new generation coming on. And I think David is the no longer a young Turk himself, but in spite of all the wonderful instruments behind him, but has done some really wonderful work over the last few years. So he is associate professor at De Montfort University in the history department, and his first book, which came out of his PhD, was on sports and British Jewry. So there's a sort of connection there to tonight's project. And then opening up an area which has really been quite neglected in scholarship. There's been so much work done on the immigrant generation before 1914, but David took it further with his second book on the second generation of British Jewry, particularly based on oral histories, and a source that's very close to my heart, the collections of the Manchester Jewish Museum, which is the most extensive carried out on that group of people. So David is moving towards sort of end of a research project, which we're going to hear about tonight, on minorities and British sport. And I'm really looking forward to tonight's paper, as I'm sure we all are, on insiders, outsiders, and ringsiders, immigrants and minorities in British sport. David.
Thank you very much, Tony. Yeah, I was actually thinking earlier that it's 11 years this week since that Viva, and I also did think about the nosebleed, which was brought on by my own stress and energy around everything, but that went well. Thank you very much for Tony's introduction, which was lovely, and thank you to Tony and to Claire and the Parks Institute for inviting me this evening. As has been mentioned, tonight's talk stems from a project I've been working on since 2019, which is funded by the Gerda Henkel Foundation. This is actually the first output, the first time that I've kind of properly talked about my project, other than to colleagues. So I'm very happy to hear any thoughts or feedback that anyone might have. Now, as Tony mentioned, my interest in boxing goes back to my PhD and my first book on sport and the British Jewish community. And within that project, I examined the rich tradition of bare-knuckle and gloved fighting in the Jewish community in the Regency period, first of all, and then into the early 20th century. I'd always wanted to do something broader on boxing, and I was lucky enough to win the funding to enable me to do this project on the sport's ethnic history in Britain more widely. Now, anyone with an interest in boxing will understand or believe it to be a sport in which immigrants and minorities have been particularly prominent and successful. Arguably, it's the sport that is most linked in the popular mindset historically, in all sorts of ways, to ethnic communities in the Western world. This is especially the case in the United States, and several historians have probed and analysed the deep historical involvement of various groups in the world of boxing, ranging from the Irish, Germans and Jewish boxers in the 19th and early 20th century to more modern studies of the Black community and the Hispanic community in the sport. Boxing is a similarly ethnic sport in Britain. I've calculated that approximately 40% of all British world champions are either first, second or third generation immigrants, and fighters from all over the world, from Canada to Fiji to Ireland, from Ireland to sub-Saharan Africa, have been based in this country. Now, driven by images like this one, this is Coventry boxer Errol Christie in 1984. There's a common understanding in Britain that success in the sport can propel individuals from the margins of British society firmly into the national consciousness. And I think this image, and the reason why I've chosen this image for the cover page, is actually really interesting and really useful. In one sense, it seems a classic picture. A victorious boxer evoking national pride, patriotism by celebrating with a national flag. And when the individual concerned is a member of a minority community, then the power increases and there's suggestions of integration, acceptance, pride, because of the vehicle of boxing. The image is much more complex, though, than it might seem at first glance. And I think that is also echoed in my project and what I'll say tonight. Christie's lifting of the Union Jack was in itself a statement about his and the Black community's continued rejection by British society. Christie had been targeted by the National Front. He'd seen racism from an early part of his life. And he noted in his autobiography, actually, with a hint of sarcasm, that he was actually criticised for holding the flag, the Union Jack, the wrong way round. Something which he said, did make him smile to himself. Now, as this picture suggests, many have historically believed boxing to be valuable for immigrants and minorities, a meritocratic route to acceptance and acclaim, with positive effects for the individual and their community. But my research has shown me something different, and I think I'll hopefully be able to show this tonight in some way. But there's been relatively little significant or enduring cultural, social, political, or financial value from boxing for Britain's ethnic minority communities. So in tonight's session, what I want to do is probe and analyse what I see as the dichotomous ethnic history of British boxing. Whilst condemnation of the sport focused mainly around the physical and psychological dangers of it have generally historically been very common, supporters of boxing have still emphasised its apparent social, behavioural, political and financial benefits that have said to be especially apparent and important for Britain's ethnic minority communities. My contention, though, is that the worth of boxing for these individuals and communities has often been overstated and excessive, seemingly driven by a simplistic view of a complicated and often opaque environment, and a misguided and Whiggish approach both around boxing, but also British society's alleged intrinsic openness and meritocracy. So as I'll show, boxing in Britain is deeply linked to Britain's minority communities, who've in turn made huge sacrifices and contributions to the sport, both inside and outside of the ring. One could say that the sport owes these individuals, and perhaps the Jewish community, most of all, arguably in various different ways, a huge debt. It would simply not exist in its modern form if it wasn't for historic involvement of immigrant and minority individuals. But the value of the sport for individual and community betterment and acceptance is historically very limited. So tonight I'm going to focus in on the four main themes of my research project: integration, identity, economics, and racism. And my approach in these sections will be to give some examples, have some discussion about where involvement in boxing has had some progressive, or seemed to have had some progressive ramifications, before detailing why caution must be adopted before we jump to too positive a conclusion. And I'll end with some brief overall comments before accepting any comments or questions that you might have. And as we're on Zoom, obviously I can't see the inline text comments. So I'll suggest that if there's a particularly important reason to stop me, if something's completely wrong and I need to be corrected, then please just unmute yourself and just shout, and I'll stop and hopefully address whatever's there. Otherwise, we'll just take some questions at the end. So I'll start with integration. And boxing, because of its large minority population, it has often been seen to be particularly meritocratic and open. How else, it has been argued, could levels of involvement and success be explained if not for some innate liberalism? The idea that there were no bars to success and acceptance if an individual was talented and motivated enough has been commonplace across the sport's history. Indeed, it's a theme that's cropped up multiple times in the British boxing press. In 1995, for instance, the idea was prominently evoked after Frank Bruno's victory in the World Heavyweight division. An editor of Boxing News newspaper, Harry Mullen, claimed that integration in the ring is absolute, and that Frank Bruno was not Frank Bruno black boxer, just Frank Bruno boxer, because of its success. This idea has actually been extolled by immigrant boxers themselves. In 1973, Des Morrison became British super lightweight champion after beating Ghanaian boxer Joe Tete in the first British title fight contended by individuals born outside of the UK. Born in Jamaica in 1950 and moving to Bedford 10 years later, Morrison claimed, "I think Joe and I made the point that boxing is one sport where colour is irrelevant. If you're good enough, you'll make it in the end, whatever your colour." Now, at first glance, this idea of the irrelevance of origin within the sport is very interesting and could seem accurate. At the very highest level, British boxing has seen immigrant and minority boxers who, because of their endeavours in the ring, have been idolised by both the boxing and wider public. The first of these was this man, Daniel Mendoza, a Jewish prize fighter whose successes during the Regency period in Britain propelled him to national fame and attention. He rose to prominence in the late 18th century, in particular because of a series of fights he had with a fellow bare-knuckle fighter called Richard Humphreys, which dominated the national consciousness, keeping events like the French Revolution off the front pages. Mendoza ended his life in poverty and physical ruin, a fate, as I'll mention again later, that befell so many boxers. But for a while, he enjoyed royal patronage, the attention of the British and international media, and importantly, was also held as a symbol of all that was best about British manliness and strength. In his autobiography, Mendoza said, "I acquired a degree of public estimation and celebrity, which perhaps few men of my rank in life ever attained." It's also important to note here, though, that integration hasn't just been seen to be something that is a byproduct of success in boxing. Boxing has often been consciously used as a vehicle to aid minority assimilation. Elite success could bring seemingly total acceptance for a talented individual, whereas training in the skills and discipline of boxing has long been viewed as having particular social and cultural value. Jewish leaders, for instance, in turn of the 20th century Britain and America, saw boxing as a cheap and useful way to rid immigrant Jews of their apparently weak and scrawny complexions. Youth leaders in black neighborhoods have so often turned to the sport to try and distract seemingly wayward youths from ill discipline. One of the most famous and successful of boxing clubs in Britain is the St Thomas Boys and Girls Club in Sheffield, where champions like Harold Graham and Nassim Hamed developed. The club was set up at the request of a local Catholic priest for ways to be found to control apparently wild local youths. Now, in his citation for an honorary degree by the University of Sheffield, in 1994, the club's Irish-born trainer, Brendan Ingle, was applauded for setting up a club that became a beacon of hope for many young people, a meeting point for all colours and creeds. And Mr. Ingle believes that if these youngsters can be motivated to look after their bodies, he can train them to look after their minds and become responsible citizens. Boxing's path to acceptance wasn't, though, a straightforward one. As this attests, integration through or because of boxing was value-laden. It was reliant on individuals conforming to wider expectations that were forced on them often by paternalism or wider social, cultural, and political pressures. As Benita Heiskanen has shown, boxing could allow outsiders to transgress the threshold from an outsider to an insider status, but often only momentarily. There are often conditions placed on acceptance within or because of boxing, and also no guarantee of universal nor enduring recognition if these were adhered to. Now, the most famous example of this, I think, is Frank Bruno, the very well-known London-born heavyweight boxer in the 1980s and 1990s. Bruno is one of the few British boxers who have crossed the threshold from sporting to national icon. He became a familiar face on British TV, in the British media. It's long been argued, however, that Bruno's iconic status depended a lot on his acting as a so-called good Negro, and someone who, according to Ben Carrington, represented an acceptable face of black masculinity, with his jokey persona, staunch patriotism, and reluctance to talk about his black identity and heritage. His approach did bring him acceptance from the mainstream, but it also led to criticism from within his own community in particular. Fellow black boxers like Errol Christie, who I mentioned earlier, questioned the implications of Bruno's approach, saying that it drove me nuts. Here was an intelligent black guy casting the image of the safe, pliant Negro, a figure of fun that white society could embrace. He was famously labelled by some British and American black boxers as an Uncle Tom figure, harking back to Harriet Beecher Stowe's depiction of the gentle, humble black slave. Community leaders were critical of Bruno for his apparent ignorance of the black cause and his roots and heritage, and for not using his status to do more within his community. After he lost one fight to the American black boxer Tim Witherspoon in the 1980s, one prominent community activist in London said, "I'm a happy man. It meant to me that the real black man had won." Now, full acceptance and acclaim could come at a considerable cost to a minority boxer. More recently, this can also be seen with the case of Amir Khan, the Bolton-born boxer of Pakistani heritage. Khan came to prominence in 2004 after his silver medal in the Athens Olympics of that year, despite being aged only 17. And as one of the few British Asians to come to prominence in the world of sport, and obviously against the post-9/11 backdrop, Khan became seen as a symbol of Muslim integration in Britain. This public role intensified only further in 2005, the year that Khan turned professional, but also the year of the London bombings, perpetrated obviously by a number of Muslim radicals. Khan's continued acceptance and success in boxing, but also in wider British society, was now intricately linked to his performance of an assumed socio-political role as a community role model, a community leader. As he highlighted several times, this was something he was uncomfortable with and felt ill prepared for, but that he felt that he had no choice but to accept. He said in his autobiography, "If I turned away from that situation, people might have thought that I was just like them," so the bombers in London. "They would have thought that I thought like them, that I hated British people and the government, and that I sympathised with them and their cause." Now, as with Frank Bruno, Khan found that his own acceptance in boxing and wider British society relied on him living up to the expectations of others surrounding his ethnic heritage and his ethnic position. Now, the second major project theme focuses on identity and the relationship between identity, minority and migrant individuals within boxing in a British context. More so than any other sport, identity is crucial to boxing. It helps develop and promote, according to Kath Woodward, the binary oppositions which lay at boxing's sporting, commercial and cultural heart. Where a boxer lives, which club or gym they represent, which manager or promoter deals with their affairs, or indeed where they come from, matters immensely in the adversarial atmosphere in which boxing exists and on which, for professional boxing in particular, its economic viability can often rest. For migrant and minority communities, whose identities can by their very nature often be in flux and transition, boxing provides opportunities and apparently positive cultural and ethnic outcomes. For one, minority or migrant success in the ring has historically been seen as an important source of ethnic pride. Achievement and wider recognition in a majority pastime has been welcomed, as has the opportunity for people to look up to ethnic peers, vicariously enjoy their success and their celebrations, and value the positive representations of their community that result. Britain's Irish population in the 19th century, for example, looked up to bare-knuckle champions like Andrew Gamble and Dan Donnelly, pictured here, with a sense of pride that was heightened in a period which witnessed continued Anglo-Irish political tensions over Irish nationhood. Jewish pugilists of the same period as Gamble and Donnelly, such as Dan Mendoza, Sam Elias, and also more recent British Jewish world champions such as Kid Lewis and Kid Berg in the first half of the 20th century, were also fervently followed by the British Jewish community. For arguably even more marginal communities, the chance to see one of their own broadly acclaimed was a welcome one, seemingly given an affirmation of their own lifestyles and life choices. You can see this with the example of Southampton's own Joe Beckett, born to a showman family and who became British heavyweight champion in May 1919. Letters of congratulations poured in to the community's own paper, the showman paper, World's Fair, after Beckett's victory, applauding his painting of an oft maligned population in such a positive, wider light. Others celebrated the fact that Beckett's formative years spent boxing on a boxing booth on local fairgrounds had proved so useful, and looked forward to the impact that this would have on the forthcoming summer season and subsequent seasons. Whilst Beckett maintained he didn't represent show people, he didn't box to represent his community, he still acknowledged the sport had a power to inspire pride and identity within his and other communities. Now, identity in and around the ring wasn't fixed. Migrant and minority boxers regularly benefited from local support and patronage in areas in which they settled, especially if they were successful. This is so clearly seen with the African boxers who made Liverpool their home and base in the 1940s and 1950s, such as future world champions Hogan Bassi and Dick Tiger. After their settlement in Liverpool from Nigeria, these and other African boxers based in the port town became regular features at local venues and came to be accepted as honorary Liverpudlians when they represented their adopted city elsewhere in Britain and in international contests. Bassi in particular spoke often about his pride to win the world title for Nigeria and Liverpool. He said, "The home of my adoption. Liverpool had seen me start in a minor bout and never lost faith in me. No matter which way I turned, I was hailed and praised as though I was locally born." Now, boxing's followers were happy to have a fluid and elastic approach to the identity of minority fighters, especially when they were successful or lived up to local or national expectations. The converse to this, and I think a useful general indicator of the conditional and uncertain nature of migrant acceptance, is what happens in those situations where expectations were unfulfilled, either initially or eventually. In those instances, the embrace and identity afforded an outsider could be withheld or ended abruptly, often with significant personal and professional consequences. I think the two best examples of this, it's two heavyweight boxers from recent times, really, Joe Bugner and Lennox Lewis. Now, Joe Bugner, a heavyweight boxer in the 1970s, 80s, and into the early 90s, and recently, actually, he's staged various comebacks. But anyway, during his early career, Bugner drew the acclaim of boxing audiences and writers in Britain for being the next British hope. Bugner was Hungarian born, left the country as a very young child. Bugner was someone who was seen to have natural talent, physical advantages. He was tall, he was strong, he was good looking. He was valued as a representative of Britain and a serious potential opponent to the increasingly Black American-dominated heavyweight division. Bugner's error, however, was to beat that great British institution, Henry Cooper, in 1971 for the British and Commonwealth crowns on a tight decision at Wembley. Now, the booing that followed the decision continued throughout Bugner's career in Britain, as did a hostile press reception. Bugner was often seen as a boring fighter, so some of the criticism was based around that side of thing, but a large proportion of it was also focused on his national heritage. After his defeat of Cooper, for instance, famed boxing writer Hugh McIlvanney rarely failed to mention Bugner's national origins in articles about his fights, even though, as I said, Joe had left the country aged only 6. Bugner later noted that Cooper, the British veteran, was beaten by an unknown immigrant before I'd at least been claimed for Britain as R. Joe, but when the press turned on me, they made sure to mention that I was born in Hungary. If I'd known the repercussions of that fight, I would have never stepped into the ring. Indeed, Bugner cites this continued opposition to him as a key reason for his eventual relocation away from Britain, first to the United States and then to Australia. Now, whereas Bugner's Britishness was seemingly abruptly withdrawn, never to be re-inferred, the opposite was true for heavyweight Lennox Lewis, who initially found that his own identity was surrounded in controversy, especially early in his career. Whereas Lewis had been born in London, his misconduct in this matter was that he was brought up in Canada, a country for whom he represented in the 1988 Olympics. When Lewis sought to start his professional career, though, he turned back to Britain and made Britain and the British title an important target and stepping stone. But he was castigated as a so-called plastic Brit and criticised for using Britain for better commercial opportunities. Indeed, in the build-up to their world title fight in 1993, which Lewis won, Frank Bruno tried to undermine his opponent's credentials by labelling himself the true Brit in that contest. Whereas sections of the press were openly hostile to Lewis during his early career, by the time that he began to truly dominate the heavyweight division by the end of the decade, the end of the 1990s, his national credentials were no longer being questioned. The turnaround was complete and that early opposition was forgotten. He'd seemingly satisfied the conditions of acceptance and had a national identity truly conferred on him. Now, the third theme of the project focuses on the economics of the sport and the economic consequences of the sport for ethnic individuals and communities. Boxing is intricately associated to the idea of social advancement, the idea that it's largely urban working class participants enjoy opportunities for social mobility and can raise their and their families' position and status through participation in the sport. For immigrants and minorities who so often inhabit the same inner city environs in which boxing's infrastructure is based, and from which many of its main actors are drawn, this notion has become tied into the idea that the sport provides a valuable escape route from ghettoized, impoverished areas and lifestyles, sometimes often to the very top, seemingly, of the financial tree. Now, financial independence and economic citizenship are desires of all, but are often so keenly and energetically sought amongst newcomers and their offspring, because often they were the drivers of immigration in the first place. Now, it's fairly easy to see why this view of the escape route, the bountiful world of boxing, has become so commonplace. Throughout its history, boxing stars have done little to hide the financial advantages of success in the sport. In some ways, boxing's commercial health has relied on this marketing and PR work. From the days of Mendoza and his mixing with royalty and sharp dressing, to the modern day fast cars, designer wardrobes and mansion housing of stars like Prince Nassim Hamed in the 1990s, minority communities have not had to look hard to find examples from the margins of society, seemingly making it big financially in the sport. Indeed, at the height of Hamed's career, it was almost impossible to ignore the motor mouth that he became. He was born in Sheffield to Yemeni parents, but such was his PR skill, his ability to sell himself and attract media attention, that he became a very common feature of the British press at this time. In financial terms, in one interview, he said, "I can't predict how much money I'm going to make from this business." He actually did. He said £400 million, although his career earnings were said to be about 10% of that in the eventuality. But anyway, he said, "I'm going to be financially secure and I'm going to have a great standard of living for the rest of my life. I will make so much money that my family and friends will live like royalty." Even at the lowest rungs of the boxing ladder, it could provide relatively lucrative and seemingly accessible incomes. In the interwar period in particular, when each town and city could have multiple venues, small halls, whatever for boxing, boxers early in their career could earn good money from the sport. A boxer at this time could earn £1 or more for an entry-level fight, a time when a skilled engineer in London was commanding between £2 to £3 a week on average. Boxing's ethnic history in Britain might be dominated by the Brunos, Khans, Hameds, Kid Lewises, Kid Bergs, but behind the stars there were hundreds from minority communities, thousands perhaps, and diverse national backgrounds, whose career in the ring, while it lasted, kept them and their families secure. Now, it's important to say that boxing didn't only provide financially for those inside the ring. There has been a long tradition in Britain of immigrant and minority entrepreneurship around the sport. In the 19th century, a number of Anglo-Irish sportsmen made money from the game, arranging and backing Irish boxers. In the early 20th century, for example, the British-Italian Viro brothers were among the most successful promoters in Liverpool, one of the sport's heartlands. In this sense, though, it does appear that the Jewish community has been particularly active. In the 19th century, Whitechapel-born Israel Lazarus became a well-known promoter in Britain before emigrating to the USA, where he became one of the key players in the nascent American professional boxing scene. The 20th century witnessed the arrival of a number of Jewish promoters and businessmen, from Jack Wolf and Harry Jacobs at the turn of the century through to Harry Levine and Mickey Duff later on. The king of all, though, and he would have said he was the king of all, was this man, Jack Solomons. According to John Harding, Solomons was the most powerful man in British boxing from the 1940s to the early 1960s because of his dominance of the biggest fights and the biggest fight deals. Indeed, the glitz and glamour that he provided, mainly by importing American fighters, succeeded in a post-war period that was dominated for a large part by shortages and austerity. Clearly, though, it's also quite well understood in the popular mindset and historically that boxing is not a street paved with gold for its minority and immigrant participants, indeed, for all its direct and indirect participants. I tried to summarize it better myself, but returning to Benita Heiskaner, I think she had it right when she said that pro boxing was a symbiotic liaison between society's margins and centers, a continuous contestation of subjugation and empowerment. I think that's right. And indeed, those who truly win in economic terms are often the ones with the most social, cultural, and political power in the sport. And I think few find particularly strong and enduring long-term economic benefits. The notion of social mobility, or an escape from the ghetto, I think, is one that's deeply written into boxing's mythology, but it needs careful reassessment. For the boxing mainstream, once deductions for things like management, training, sparring partners, and importantly, tax were taken out, they could often be on starvation wages for one of the most dangerous and uncertain and short-lived professions possible. Yes, there were individuals inside and outside of the ring who made good money out of the sport and secured their and their families' financial futures, but the number who reached this point and stayed there is small, with many more rags to riches to rags tales out there as ones of success. And perhaps the most famous example of the fickleness of the social mobility that the sport could bring is Randolph Turpin, the Leamington Spa-born boxer who claimed the world middleweight title for 64 days in 1951. Now, Randolph Turpin was one of the famous Turpin boxing brothers who were born to a Guyanese father and an Anglo-Irish mother. Turpin was said to have made over £300,000 in his career, the equivalent of 6.5 million today. But because of bad advice, his own naivety, exploitation by others, by the early 1960s, Turpin was penniless. He was working in a transport cafe and being chased by the Inland Revenue over unpaid taxes. And in May 1966, he committed suicide. And his biographers noted that whilst boxing gave Turpin every chance to equip himself for a lasting life of respectability and comfort, his complete lack of financial acumen, something so common within boxing, meant that he ended up with nothing. Now, the best evidence, I think, that boxing is not an enduring route to social mobility for minority communities is what happens when these communities see broader social advancement outside of the sport. The best example of this is the Jewish communities of the US and the UK. Jews dominated the sport in many different ways in the interwar period. One American historian has said that over 25% of all professional boxers at one point were Jewish, but Jews disappeared from the inside of the ring rapidly after World War II. What happened was that these communities moved physically away from boxing's heartlands in the inner cities and culturally and psychologically left behind the working class environments in which the sport thrived and held greatest appeal. Their advancement was not because of boxing. Their advancement had a huge impact on their and their community's participation within the sport. Now, whilst boxers like Randolph Turpin, British-born black boxers like him, could rely often on successful amateur careers and local fan bases to help bolster their commercial appeal, immigrant black boxers were often at a huge financial disadvantage in this respect. Indeed, although in the modern day, British boxers of Commonwealth heritage have become the biggest stars and earners in the sport, this wasn't always the case. Things have changed. Whereas in the early period, from the 40s through to the 70s in particular, representatives from the black community were numbers were relatively small and marginal within the sport. They were often widely avoided by promoters because they weren't seen as marketable. They didn't seem to have market value within the activity. Two examples of this and this problem were the two bunnies, Bunny Sterling and Bunny Johnson, who were Jamaican-born child migrants to the UK, who went on to win British titles. Throughout their career, like most black boxers actually until the 1980s, they struggled to command top-level attention due to the belief that mainly white audiences didn't want to pay to watch them. Their white trainer, George Francis, noted that this meant that their success in the sport was particularly hard-won. They relied on last-minute invitations for fights, poor purses, they were often matched against heavier boxers. Indeed, on the financial front, when Bunny Johnson became the first black British heavyweight champ in 1975, his earnings for each fight were only a few £100s after deductions. It was commonplace throughout Johnson and Sterling's careers, the latter at middleweight, for venues to refuse to hold their fights as they believed that they would be run at a loss. Now, moving on to the final project theme, which focuses on racism and discrimination. Now, many historians, sports historians, have noted that the visibility and apparent success of minorities within boxing, both in Britain and globally, because of that, a view could be arrived at that it was somehow less racist than other social, cultural, and economic environments. As my close colleague at De Montfort has said previously, Martin Polly, the public identification of boxing as a sport of opportunity and mobility has helped to maintain a common sense notion of the sport as an arena free from racism. Now, multiple commentators, Nelson Mandela no less being one, have talked of the egalitarian nature of the sport. In the ring in particular, race or ethnicity becomes irrelevant and skill seemingly becomes the ultimate leveler. Indeed, in the official history of the British boxing title, it's said that the fight game at all levels prides itself on its apparent colourblindness. Now, in support of this notion, we could point to the fact that boxing was, as Matt Taylor and Martin Johns have highlighted, a rare space where minorities were discussed in public without primary reference to their race, and that there was dignity and financial rewards gained through boxing, unavailable in so many areas of British society. Boxing seemingly brought recognition, pride of self, personal and economic benefits to individuals hailing from communities whose reception and life experiences in Britain were otherwise severely impacted by racial and ethnic hostility. Now, on occasions, it's been said, boxing has been said to have positively impacted on wider discrimination and wider racism in Britain too. And the best examples of this come from the Jewish community. One example, for instance, comes from the time of Daniel Mendoza, when his and other Jewish prize fighters' success in the ring seemingly improved wider Jewish life at this time. After a peak of anti-Semitic violence in Britain in the 1770s, after the so-called Chelsea murders perpetrated by a Jewish gang, contemporary commentators believe that a key reason for apparent declines in attacks on Jews later in that century was the phenomenon of the Jewish pugilist. Francis Place, the very well-known social reformer, for instance, said that the consequence of Mendoza and his contemporary success was in a very few years seen and felt. It was no longer safe to insult a Jew, but even if the Jew were unable to defend themselves, the few who would be disposed to insult them merely because they were Jews would be in danger of chastisement from the passers-by and of punishment from the police. This was actually a notion that was returned to in the 1930s, when in some quarters it was believed that the success of Jewish boxers in Britain like Kid Lewis and Kid Berg were helping to undermine the growing fascist threat to Jewish persons and property. Indeed, in 1934, just as European and British fascism truly began to be seen as a serious political and ethnic threat, the Jewish Chronicle wrote of boxing doing more than cartloads of oratory and writing to undermine anti-Semitism, explaining their idea that anti-Semitism was apparently so minimal in Britain and the United States because of the strong Jewish boxing traditions that existed in those two countries. Now, similarly, countless boxers have spoken about how their profile in the sport had wider benefits in terms of anti-racism, much like Muhammad Ali claimed throughout his career in terms of American Black society. Those like Antiguan-born British and world champion Maurice Hope in the 70s and 80s, for instance, who regarded themselves as exemplars and embodiments of Black ambition and drive. Or like those champions of the 1980s and 1990s, individuals like John Conte, Lloyd Honeyghan, both honoured by the United Nations for their refusal to defend world titles in South Africa or against South African boxers as a way of making wider anti-apartheid and anti-racism statements. Jamaican-born Hoonigan famously dumped his World Boxing Association belt in a bin in 1986 and turned down a £1 million purse in his own personal stance. He noted, "I have to walk the streets in the morning. I have to walk the streets and look people in the face. I have to get up in the morning and look at myself in the mirror. I have to think of my own people." Hoonigan and Conte actually were both very critical of Frank Bruno when he chose to fight a heavyweight, South African heavyweight in 1986. The plain truth, though, is that boxing and boxers did little to affect racism in wider British society. Their actions and statements, indeed their very presence, may have provided viable symbolism in wider struggles, but the enduring situation for minority boxers has been an extremely difficult one, suffering from wider racist attitudes and assumptions seeping into the sport, and the plainly racist attitudes of boxing's authorities and internal environment. Racism has been written into the sport's rules in Britain, egregiously harming the opportunities for minority boxers. For instance, between 1911 and 1948, black boxers were forbidden for fighting for British titles under rules initially formally adopted, but then written into regulations. This rule, the so-called colour bar, originated in 1911, when a proposed contest between the American black boxer Jack Johnson and the British fighter Billy Wells for the World Heavyweight Championship was blocked by the Home Office for its potential to fan racial unrest in Britain and its empire. Now, successive British governments actually insisted that boxing could set its own rules, but the boxing authorities interpreted 1911 and the ruling by the Home Office as meaning that effectively any major black versus white fight in Britain could be ruled illegal. Now, under the British Boxing Board of Control rules that were in place between 1929 and 1947, and preceded by a de facto ban on black contenders by the National Sporting Club, boxers had to be British born of two white parents to be eligible to be contenders for a British title. Although there was significant wider media and public pressure to drop the colour bar, a bar which hampered the careers of a succession of black British and Empire boxers, the board remained steadfast until after World War II, when political and public pressure forced them to change the rule. There was seemingly concerns that the colour bar would hamper relations between Britain and its Commonwealth, its new Commonwealth, and also concerns that black sacrifice for the British and Empire cause during World War II had shown that the colour bar was an unfair ruling and something that needs to be changed. Even after the colour bar was dropped, though, the sport's rules regarding immigrant boxers and residency clauses in order to be able to fight for British titles remain significantly out of kilter with British law. Now, whilst boxing's authorities have discriminated against minorities, hostility has been commonplace across the sport's history in Britain from the very first instance, from Mendoza's time onwards. Now, in Mendoza's era, notions of Jewish cunning, hidden hands, clannishness were widespread to explain his success, whereas black boxers, when they first started to achieve national and international success in the early 20th century, it was explained away because of their intrinsic physical differences, their gorilla-like arms, their thick skulls, their insensitivity to pain. Indeed, the lead boxing writer for the Daily Express in the 1920s said that black boxers were a blend of human and animal beings. Stan Shipley has said that Britain's small hall boxing culture, prominent from the end of the 19th century through to the 1960s, within that, ethnic, religious and racial tensions could often make the atmosphere ugly. Anti-Semitism was never far away when critical comment was passed on Jewish entrepreneurs like Jack Solomons and Harry Levine, whilst black Commonwealth and British-born boxers were regularly labelled dark threats to British culture, the British economy and impressionable white women and girls. At a time when Commonwealth boxers effectively kept boxing in Britain alive in the 1950s due to their willingness to fight for low purses, as substitutes, or as fodder for up-and-coming champions, British writers like Tony Kushner in the Sunday Dispatch were calling for caps and quotas to be introduced to save the sport for the white Britain. Now, I could go on to talk about the huge and often violent opposition to minority boxers and their fans from the British far right, the regular racist taunts or comments made by boxers in press conferences or in clinches, the instances where Jewish and black boxers were banned from hotels and guest houses in the cities that they were due to fight in, or about the exploitation of minority boxers by unscrupulous promoters, the outcry and death threats received when black boxers married white women, as was the case with Frank Bruno, or indeed about how racism in the street, school, or youth club actually forced many to take up boxing in the first place for self-protection. The point, though, is a key one. Whatever narrative certain sections of Britain's boxing or wider society might put forward about the sport, it has been anything but colourblind or racism free. Discrimination against immigrants and minority boxers has seemingly been ever present within the sport in Britain, hampering careers, undermining financial securities, and causing untold physical and psychological damage. Those that have seen success or achievement in the sport have often found it tainted, transitory, or driven by some underlying economic or political agenda that served a wider rather than their own interest. So to conclude, I think it's clear that throughout boxing's history in Britain, a long history in Britain, there's been significant immigrant and minority involvement. In many ways, that wouldn't be a surprising conclusion of this talk or this project, given the popular understanding regarding the sport's links to these communities. What may surprise some people, though, is the length and breadth of participation by these groups, both as fighters and in boxers' wider culture. In effect, as I said, boxing in Britain owes a huge historical debt to its most marginalised communities. It's also clear, though, that the sport did little to improve these communities' positions in or in the eyes of wider society. Wider struggles and hostilities were present within boxing, and achievement in the sport did little to affect this broader picture. It's not what British society thinks that minorities have gained from boxing that's important or accurate, as most often than not, such views are clouded by an ignorance over the plight and sacrifice of ethnic boxers themselves. The reality is that the most value gained through the sport is that it helped certain minorities and certain individuals to be and to feel visible, and to provide examples of achievement and success that were down the road of hard work and motivation, though these have often been fleeting and not necessarily wholesome or enduring. My argument as well would be that the narrative that exists within boxing about its ethnic participants is harmful. The colour blindness idea, the idea of an escape from the ghetto, these myths have had long-standing harmful effects in the sense that they act as key drivers for many into the sport and often act as a false basis for continued participation. Few immigrant boxers have said, from what I've read, that they regretted their ring careers, but the vast majority have openly said that they regretted that the promise that boxing seemingly offered them in the first instance was often a false one. Indeed, as this is a key conclusion to end with, ethnic achievement and benefit from the ring has so often come in spite of, rather than because of, boxing's social, cultural, financial, and political character. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dave, and that was a wonderful presentation and very powerfully argued. So if we could ask for comments and questions. Could I start us off whilst people are getting their thoughts together about whether I'm sort of desperately trying to find some sort of safe space here for your overall analysis of whether you could explore inter-ethnic relations through boxing, of whether that's also been a conflictual one, or whether there's been alliances between different migrant origin groups in boxing.
There's examples of both, and it's very interesting actually. In some ways, you might expect some kind of concord that there would be in the face of a wider struggle, there'd be a kind of a unified action against the greater picture. Often though, what you find is that these oppositions and these hostilities are so deeply ingrained that actually ethnic boxers themselves, ethnic and minority boxers themselves, are kind of drawn into this adversarial atmosphere and this difficulty. There are examples of individuals looking at each other's plight and seeing a wider cause. A good example of this is in the 1930s, when you have 1920s and 1930s, when you have a British-born black boxer called Len Johnson, who's born in Manchester, and also a time where you have a boxer called Larry Gaines, who's a black boxer from Canada, and both are struggling against the colour bar, and both are making public comment about each other, kind of saying, well, if they can do this and they can succeed in getting, through this kind of brick wall, then that will benefit me. So there is that kind of wider sense of looking at each other and seeing that struggle, but often because of the nature of the sport and the demands of the sport for opposition and oppositional attitudes and assumptions, you just don't seem to have that from what I've come across. It's very interesting, actually. That's something that I'd not necessarily noticed in my research thus far. But no, good question, actually, Tony. Something for me to think about and look at in some detail.
Thank you very much. And I think Shelby has got a question, and then Tony Stoller. So Shelby, if you want to unmute.
Did I unmute?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Oh, crazy. Technologia. What I was curious about when you were talking about Jack Johnson, I noted that if you study Joe Louis, one of the attractions of Joe Louis to American boxing promoters is that he wasn't as in your face as Jack Johnson, who was kind of a predecessor to Muhammad Ali and his in your faceness. I mean, I remember the Cassius Clay bout with, what's his name? The first big bout where Cassius Clay was going against the guy. He was a thug. You felt sorry for Clay's opponent, but he was the same kind of in-your-face type of boxer. So anyway, thanks for a very interesting talk.
No, my pleasure. I mean, I think it's very interesting in that, what happened with black boxers in America and then later on, actually, in Britain, there were echoes of this, is that they wanted to be anti-Jack Johnsons. Why they didn't want to be anti-Jack Johnsons. Wider boxing culture insisted on them being anti-Jack Johnsons. Jack Johnson was flamboyant. He had white women. He spent his money lavishly. It was one of the reasons why the American and British authorities despised him so much, that he wasn't this compliant black man that they wanted him to be to set the tone for American and black British society. But what you find with people like Joe Louis, and then later on, actually, with other examples, is that there's a realization that if you're going to be successful in boxing, you can't be that Jack Johnson style figure and be black. You've got to change that approach. And there's echoes of that with Frank Bruno in the 1980s, and the fact that it's said that the advice that he was given was that he had to kind of toe a certain line in order to gain that acceptance in that national situation. But it's interesting, the demands that are placed on individuals within the sport are often very powerful and very enduring. But no, thank you, Shelby, and thank you for your comment as well.
Thank you. And I think questions are coming in now. Tony Stoller next, please.
David, terrific presentation. Thank you very much. Very, very compelling. I'm interested in a reverse angle of one of the points you made. You talked about the East End Jewish community in the 20s and 30s, and indeed other immigrant communities, taking great pride in the success of their co-religionists. I wonder whether there is a reverse effect, whereby the success of people like Ted Kid Lewis encouraged those young men in the East End Jewish communities to take up boxing, and so promoted a physical activity which actually wasn't all that easy in the situation in which they were living. I have to declare an interest. My father was a young East End Jewish amateur boxer, but I wonder whether that is a general pattern you have seen.
There's definitely examples where that's the case, and Kid Lewis is really interesting. As I said, you know, he was a hero to the Jewish East End, as was Jack Kidberg in a slightly later period. They were idolized by seemingly the everyday working class Jew who's living in the East End. They were hated by sections of the Jewish establishment at the time. You know, in fact, there's an interesting situation that occurs in one of the Jewish youth clubs in Stepney. They try and engage Ted Kid Lewis as a boxing trainer at one point, and basically the committee turn around and say, we can't do this, we don't want to do this, because we don't want to encourage our youth down the route of professional boxing. It's unhealthy, it's not wholesome enough. And it's interesting, actually, that example kind of shows that, as I kind of touched on at the very start of the presentation, you know, boxing was seen to have this value. You know, it could be a training of the mind, it could be training of the body. But stepping into the professional ring and making money from the sport and doing something that wasn't seen to be respectable in certain areas could also be problematic. It's why it's so interesting in 1934 and at other points in the 1930s that the Jewish Chronicle suddenly says, we love our Jewish boxers, they're great, you know, they're showing us the way against the fascist threat. You know, you go back 10, 15 years and the Jewish Chronicle's castigating them and criticizing Jewish boxers for bringing disrepute onto the community and showing the community in a bad light. So again, wider social, political tensions and environments kind of have a big impact on what's happening in and around the ring. But no, thank you, Tony. Thank you for your comment as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So we've got two more hands up and also a question in the chat from Anushka. So Claire, I think you're next.
Thank you, Tony. And yeah, I agree with everything that was said. It was very compelling and illuminating. So thank you, David, for that. My question is about this difference, I guess, or should we make a difference between the boxers who became professional and who made money out of it and who fought for titles? And you very convincingly showed that there were a lot of expectations for them to comply with I don't know what Britain wanted them to look like. But if you look at the boxers in local communities and who did not become professionals, was boxing still this place where there was a lot of discrimination and racism, or did it lead to some, I don't know, interactions and interethnic integration?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. And actually, this is a good point to raise. The boxing gym, the gym environment, you know, before it becomes focused on, you know, on professional kind of training and professional achievement, has so often been said by multiple people. Actually, there's been some sociological studies that have been done as well about the boxing gym as kind of a unifier of ethnicities. You know, one example that I've kind of come across is the gym of George Francis, the white trainer who took on so many black boxers, black immigrant boxers, and you know, worked to kind of further their careers. In his autobiography, he talks about the fact that, the gym environment, he said it was open to all comers. And he kind of says in his autobiography, in a little bit of a flowery way, but it's there, he says, there may have been initial tensions, when a black man walked in off the street, but within 5 minutes, that had disappeared. And okay, he's building a picture there of what the environment and what the character of that gym and was, and that's been done elsewhere. But there's definitely something there about, it is a leveler, and actually there's been interactions and kind of opportunities for new acquaintances across ethnic groups and ethnic communities. There's a study by Ernest Cashmore as well, another sociologist, of a black British sportsman, and he talks a bit about boxing in the 1980s and 1980s. And a similar thing said there, it was an opportunity for black people to actually be in the same physical space as white people, and to share an environment which in so many other aspects of their life just wasn't available to them. So yeah, we need to be careful. I think it's a good point. Care needs to be exercised to think about what is said and what is seen to be happening in this kind of elite level, where there are often these financial and political pressures, and then what's happening on the everyday as well. So no, that's also a very useful point and a very interesting thing to think about in a bit more detail, perhaps. Yeah, thank you, Claire.
Thanks. And Gary's next, and then we've got a couple of questions in the chat, and also Matt Taylor's got his hand up. So Gary Shaw next, please.
Sorry, just unmute myself there. Yeah, cheers for that talk. Really, really good, really interesting. Touched on a lot of points that I've researched myself as well. It's generally a really broad question I was going to ask, or an observation really, and it touches a little bit upon where you said about the this myth of boxing being a way out of the ghetto for people of any skin color really. And I'm just thinking that to me is a sort of romanticizing of the sport, which it generally doesn't deserve, because it's unlike any other sport in the world, boxing. It's more a business than a sport. And I think that if you approach it in that way, then you maybe underestimate things which should be more important, and overestimate things which shouldn't be. And I'm thinking there of, we could go back to Andrew Jeffer fighting Curly Watson in 1907 for a version of the British title. It wasn't actually a British title, and how people like Gaines, Kid Tanner, Cliff Anderson, people like this who did well out of the sport, should have done well out of the sport financially, but probably didn't. But also what you touched upon about Bruno as well. And I think it's sometimes a misunderstanding of how the business of boxing works. It's sometimes framed as a sport that can be studied in the way that other sports are historically. And I think that fails to take account of the business side of it. And there was I forget which boxer said it, you referred to them, where they said to each other, though, that if you're good enough, then you're gonna do well. That's a complete and utter misunderstanding of what boxing's like. It's never been like that. And I think Bruno did well, and people maybe resented him a little bit. He never fought for a British title, Bruno. In fact, he avoided a lot of British fighters who wanted to fight him, and he was one of the most well-managed, carefully managed boxers going. And I'm just wondering if that sort of slight lack of recognition of how the business of boxing works maybe has influenced people's perceptions of it historically.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of interesting points you've made there, Gary. And I think the key kind of response is, there is an overly simplistic view of the sport that exists, and actually there's an overly simplistic view of the sport and its financial character and its social and cultural character from within the sport itself. From a lot of boxers go into think about the sport when they're entering the professional ranks, for instance, and have gone in with a naivety that has really severely hampered them later on. It's a really difficult one, because there's an interest being served in the perpetuation of the narrative, of the idea of what boxing in Britain and in America as well actually is and actually does for ethnic communities and minority individuals. And I suppose a key aim of, I kind of knew a bit about this from my study on the Jewish community in boxing, but it's become even more apparent to me that actually that's so far wide of the mark. And actually you can look at people like Randolph Turpin, for instance, and see a really tragic and difficult fall from grace and a difficult position that's ended in there. So yeah, I think it's a key kind of aspect of my project, trying to paint this much more accurate position. Once you look into it, once people have paid their taxes, for instance, the money that you can make is often pretty minimal for something that is so dangerous, so short-lived, but still is so incredibly appealing to so many different people for often reasons that are pretty flawed or rooted in difficult scenarios. But yeah, I've kind of tried to respond to your comment there, Gary. I don't know how well I've answered your question particularly, but hopefully I've given some kind of an adequate sense of my own perspective back.
Yeah, I was just thinking that maybe it is something which a lot of academics, when they study it, it's maybe not as appreciated or understood as much as it should be. It's a tough sport, but it's more of a business, and it's not really about how good you are. And regardless of colour, if you sell tickets, which Jepfer did, which Gaines did, especially in Leicester, where he sold out shows at the rugby ground and people did want him to win. Len Johnson did the same in Manchester. There were members of the board in 1929, 1930, the area board, who were appointed by the Boxing Board of Control, who campaigned for the colour bar and for him to fight Roland Todd at the time. So I do think it is it's maybe a bit underestimated by some academics, simply how the business itself works. And if you're good enough and you sell tickets, then really it's not about how good you are, regardless of skin colour, I think.
Thanks very much. We've got quite a few coming in now. Just to go to the chat, Anushka, and I'll read it. It's interesting, so this is from Anushka, it's interesting how apparent this continues to be, for example, with Tyson Fury proclaiming himself the Gypsy King. And the question is, have you looked specifically into this minority group when there is still substantial accepted, inverted commas, racism against the traveller communities?
Yeah, I have. And actually, when I had another look at my talk today, I did think Gypsy and traveller boxers were an element that I didn't cover in anywhere near enough detail. There's a really strong tradition of boxing, both gloved and bare knuckle, within the traveller community in Britain. And yeah, they have. The community has faced significant wider racism. But boxing is really interesting, actually, to travellers and traveller communities. There's a lot that's been written by traveller boxers themselves about how it's been a really important part of their identity, of the community. To be Gypsy King, to be the most successful boxer within the community, seemed to be a huge accolade, and something that has such an important so many important social and cultural reverberations across it. Tyson Fury is an interesting example. I mean, he's kind of used his heritage for different ways in commercial sense, and has done that quite successfully. But he's also been quite open about the issues and struggles that he and his community and his family have had in terms of their kind of early work and traditions in the boxing ring. So yeah, it is something that I've looked into, and it's something that's going to feature quite significantly in the project, especially the idea that boxing itself is seen as a really important part of traveller identity in Britain. It is something that is seen to be kind of crucial to traveller manhood and masculinity, even into the modern day, where bare knuckle fighting is still seemingly very popular within that community and population. So yes, so the talk coverage, I did try and cover as much ground as I could, but I did see that was a gap that I had there. But no, it's a community that does feature and will feature in various ways.
Okay, I think Matt Taylor was next. If you could unmute, Matt.
Yes, Oh, whoops. Apologies. Yeah, I had to move rooms. Sorry, connection problems. Dave, enjoyed it. Just a couple of really quick things. First, I just wanted, it's a big question, but any comments on the kind of boxing's inherent transnationality and how that might factor into your project? You know, we've talked about some, you know, African-American boxers and things like that, but the impact of ethnic communities elsewhere, particularly the link with the US, I guess. And secondly, very briefly, you might be able to put away, female boxers. Are they going to feature?
Female boxers are interesting because there are female bare-knuckle boxers that are out there in Mendoza's time and in that period. And obviously in the modern day, you've had, you know, people who've gone on to achieve considerable success in the professional area, people like Nicola Adams, the black boxer from Leeds. The recent kind of changes in terms of what's happened in terms of women boxers probably won't feature any great amount. I'm kind of thinking of my cutoff, as is often the case with historical projects. You kind of feel that you need a cutoff that doesn't feel too contemporary. I'm currently thinking I'm going to work up to about Amir Khan in 2005 and kind of leave things there. And I think, you know, actually the problem of that is that it does leave some significant changes in terms of women's boxing and the participation of various minority and migrant individuals, you know, out of that. So, you know, boxing's interesting in that, you know, women, you know, were fighting. There were women fighters. There were very famous women fighters, you know, in Britain, but there weren't many of them, and there definitely weren't many from an ethnic or minority background. The transnational element's interesting, and yeah, I think it links into this idea. You know, identity is so crucial to the sport. You know, it's especially at a professional level. It's what it's kind of based around, and that mobility is absolutely crucial. You know, well, you know better than I do. You're more of an expert on the transnationalism of the sport than I am, and you know, you've written a lot about how, you know, it is an interconnected world. You know, we talked with Gary about the financial side of things, the economic side of things. Well, you know, the finances and economics rely on an international character to the sport at the highest level. So you do have to be mobile, and it's interesting actually how boxers have kind of used their ethnicity and their background within different national environments, and it's meant different things. You know, you had boxers, for instance, in the late 19th century, you know, who were Irish boxers. I'm thinking of here that, you know, that moved over to America and you know, kind of used their Irishness to further their careers in a different way. But the transnational element is an interesting one, and again, you know, I need to think about how much I'm going to tap into what's happening outside of Britain and what I'm going to cover outside of Britain for British fighters and for people involved in Britain's boxing establishment. You know, thinking about it from the promoting and management point of view as well. I mean, you look at an individual like Jack Solomons, and you know, he's relying on the international mobility of fighters to come and fight for him, and he, you know, he has big struggles and big clashes with the British authorities about work permits, and working with the Ministry of Labour saying, you know, let these individuals in, you know, they're bringing cash in. You know, the Ministry of Labour says, yeah, but they're taking cash out when we don't want them to take cash out of the country as well. So there's tensions there, and that international character, that transnational character is really important. And again, something that, you know, there's a lot to think about still. This project's got a lot of time to run and to think about as I turn it into a written output. But yeah, a couple of interesting angles to think about even further there. But thank you, Matt.
Okay, Martin Poli was going to ask about women boxers as well, and there's a little bit of chat about that going on. So that, I think, leaves what I think will probably be the last question, and it's in the chat from Cameron Beaver. Brilliant presentation, Dave, which we can all echo. Do you think there are levels to the acceptance of minority boxers by the white establishment? I think about the support of Frazier over Ali. Despite Frazier's being flamboyant, he wasn't a Muslim and wasn't as outrageous as Ali. Is the white establishment more willing to integrate boxers if it serves a wider discriminatory cause?
Well, I think if you look, as I've kind of touched on, you know, with Frank Bruno and the kind of the role that he played, how consciously he played that role and how much it was something that he was told to play is continually seeming to be unclear. But if you contrast him to people, you know, to his contemporaries, people like John Conte, Lloyd Honeyghan, who were much more focused on their blackness, on the fact that they had a black identity and black heritage, and were outspoken about the black community in Britain, about the struggles that the community faced, and were actually very critical of other individuals like Frank Bruno, like Chris Eubank as well in a slightly later period, who was seemingly playing up to some kind of developing some kind of persona that was a false one that could serve the wider boxing culture and boxing economy in an effective way, but did nothing to further the cause of their heritage and of their own community. So I think Cameron's right in the sense that, you know, there's limitations on the role that minority boxers are allowed to play, and that there's limitations on the level of acceptance of those individuals with the roles that they play. You know, if they've conformed historically to what's, you know, seemed to be a useful or acceptable kind of persona or approach, then that's great. You know, they're allowed that freedom and that acceptance, and they can kind of continue within the boxing environment. But if they try and do something a little bit different, it can jar against the authorities or against the kind of contemporary political or social situation, then that acceptance and that kind of openness can be quite quickly withdrawn. And I think that's kind of, it's kind of a broader point, I think, of the project and of the talk, and it'll be something I'm really going to focus on when I work on kind of written outputs from the project, that, you know, actually people have this very simplistic view of boxing and sport in general in many ways, that, you know, if you're successful, whatever your background, you know, you'll get accepted, you'll be integrated, you'll be seen as a success. But actually there's so many different things at play in the background and affecting that level of tolerance, and often that level of tolerance is so focused on, you know, pressures that have nothing to do with the interests of the individuals concerned at all anyway. So but yeah, again, I've kind of worked around that question there, Cameron. I hope I've given you some kind of answer or links from the project to that, but no, thank you very much.
Great. Well, I think Martin Poley in the chat has summed it up, just said, brilliant talk. Thanks, Dave. I'll have to do a bit more than that, but thank you also for answering all the questions so well. It's a really exciting project, and it's great to see it sort of coming towards its conclusion. I should also add that today we're following the government's Levelling Up programme and having a sort of chair and a speaker from the north. So there we go. Michael Gove, eat your heart out. Right. So I think just to thank Dave really for a great paper, and just to pass on to Claire, who will tell you about our forthcoming events.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dave and Tony. It was really wonderful. And just to mention the forthcoming events, so we have a very good research seminars program this year. So the next one will be on the Thursday 17th of February, and we will hear about Jews in Habsburg Monarchy by Marsha Rosenblick. And we also have named lectures, and this year, exceptionally, we will have Michael Rosen, who will give a talk and who will come to Southampton on the 8th of June. So you can already book your tickets. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day and have a good evening, or bye-bye.